Welcome to the City of Detroit's week-long kickoff of Black History Month. This week, we are showcasing all the ways Detroit has contributed to American excellence in music, literature, poetry, fashion, architecture, dance, and the culinary arts. Enjoy! We also are using this week to launch Undefeated, a year-long celebration of Detroit arts and culture, featuring monthly showcases of our creative genius. Visit DetroitArtsAndCulture.com for details.
So we're standing here at Alfonso Wells Memorial Park, and behind me is the Burwood Wall. This wall was built in 1940 to separate two neighborhoods, a predominantly African-American neighborhood on the Burwood side, which is where I'm standing, and on the other side, on the Mendota side, was a white development. So what's happened is in 1934, the federal government passes the first federal housing bill, the first National Housing Act, the National Housing Act of 1934. It is part of the New Deal. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt is passing this to assist working class people in getting a home loan. It's the Great Depression, and they're unable to get a home loan by going to a mortgage company or a bank. And so for these working class people to get a home loan during the Great Depression, they're going to need assistance from the federal government. The federal government is already involved in paying construction workers to go back to work and build homes because the housing stock in large parts of the United States is inadequate for the amount of people who live there. Many of the people who own homes are in foreclosure during the Great Depression, and many of the people who want to get a home are unable to get a home loan. The federal government creates the Federal Housing Administration under the National Housing Act of 1934. The FHA is going to back those home loans for working class people. So instead of them trying to go to a bank and be turned down, or going to a bank or a mortgage company and that bank giving them an interest rate of 12 and 13 or 14%, the FHA is going to back those loans at 3% interest rate, 2%, in some cases 1%, with a low down payment to assist working class folks to get a home loan. However, there's a caveat that the federal government is doing. And the federal government is giving these home loans to working class people with the express purpose that they cannot be given in integrated neighborhoods. So that means if there's African Americans and whites living around each other in the same neighborhood, then the FHA won't back those loans. The neighborhoods have to be racially homogeneous, meaning one race. And what the federal government really means is all white. And so when African Americans attempt to get these loans in places like Detroit and Chicago, but we're talking about Detroit, many of them are working class African Americans. They're working at Ford, they're working at Dodge, they're working at Packard, they're working at these plants, and they're working class people making a pretty good wage. But the federal government is saying, if you want this loan, we can't give it to you because you're going to move into an area where white people live. And we do not give loans in integrated neighborhoods. By the same token, if whites want this loan, they have to move away from where black people live. So to get the loan, they have to go to areas that are all white. This area has a number of black people who've been living here since the 1920s when they came from down south during the Great Migration to the city of Detroit. The center area for black people's residence is Black Bottom in the lower east side of the city of Detroit. But it's become overcrowded. An area that is able to sustain 30,000 people has 140,000 people living in it. So African Americans secretly build their own homes in this area. So when the federal government starts paying for houses to be built just north of where we are, when they find out that African Americans live here, they're going to stop the building of those homes and they're going to stop the financing and backing of those home loans. The white developer builds this wall in accordance with the federal government's directives, a 6-foot wall to separate the white housing development from where black people live. And so that 6-foot wall was a segregation wall. It ran from 8 Mile to Chippewa, so roughly a half-mile long wall at 6 foot high. And this would allow whites who were buying these homes to get a home loan backed by the FHA. This is a sad period of America's history. The African Americans were blocked from one of the central ways of building wealth and moving up economically, and that is owning a home. The federal government was giving home loans to working class people, and African Americans were blocked from being a part of one of the largest building of wealth in America's history, and that is getting a low interest rate home loan backed by the FHA. This will be outlawed by the federal government itself in 1968. 1 week after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated, the federal government passes the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And that will outlaw the practices of real estate companies, banks, and the federal government itself, and their practices of keeping African Americans from getting home loans that would be backed by the FHA. But of course, the damage had already been done. For decades, African Americans were blocked from getting home loans while whites were buying homes that were appreciating in value. So whites, of course, moved up in wealth. By the time we get to the 60s and 70s, they've owned homes for 30 and 40 years, and that home that they bought for $8,000 is now worth $80,000, $60,000, in some cases $100,000. So they moved up in wealth. They're able to use the equity in that home loan to open up a business, send their kids to college, buy more property. African Americans have been stuck in paying rent if they were working class people because they could not get those home loans. And so now the damage is done. You have a wealth gap. You have unequal education because housing and education go hand in hand. And you also have environmental racism because you have factories moving into areas where a lot of renters live, which will of course be more African Americans, and less factories moving into areas where people are homeowners, which of course would be more whites in those areas. And so we have all of these as holdovers from housing segregation and housing discrimination practiced by the federal government. And this wall is an indication of that. And about a decade or so ago, an artist and of course people from the community did this mural on this wall, at least on this part in the park in Alfonso Wells Memorial Playground. So we can see this mural that changes this wall from being just a cold, dead, gray segregation wall to a wall that kind of expresses the community's feelings about where they live. And so even though it's still a historical site that tells us that segregation demanded that there be a wall built in the city of Detroit, it also has the aspirations of the community drawn and painted on the wall. Second Baptist Church is the oldest black church in the state of Michigan. It was founded in 1836 by 13 black people. These black people are leaders in the abolitionist movement. So they will establish this church not only as a faith center, although it will definitely be that, it'll also be a freedom center. For African Americans in the 1800s, faith and freedom go hand in hand. If you're talking about worshiping God and doing that which is right, for African Americans, that means helping people escape from slavery. So faith and freedom go hand in hand. The churches are major sites in the Underground Railroad. And Second Baptist Church will be the headquarters of the Underground Railroad from the 1830s when it is founded all the way into the Civil War. The church will also be the first school for African Americans in the city of Detroit because African Americans realize, black people realize that faith and freedom demand education. If you are practicing your faith, if you are a believer in freedom, then you must be a proponent, a supporter of education. And so the first school for African Americans is inside a Second Baptist Church. And so it is a school, it is a faith center, it is a freedom center, it is a civil rights center. The founders of Second Baptist Church, many of them were part of the uprising to free Thornton and Lucy Blackburn in 1833. This black man and black woman who escaped from slavery in Kentucky came to the city of Detroit, were captured by bounty hunters and the sheriff, and an uprising will free them. And this uprising will cause the death of the sheriff. Lucy Blackburn will be whisked away after a visit from Caroline French, one of the founders of Second Baptist Church, who goes into the jail cell with her to visit her and switches clothes with her inside of the jail cell. And so this daring escape by these African Americans will prompt them to stand up against the segregationist policies of First Baptist Church, which was the white church at that time. And because First Baptist Church refuses to change its segregation policies, this group of African Americans founds their own church, Second Baptist Church. Out of this church, 30 other churches will be founded out of this church, 2 of which are in Canada. And the founders of this church will go on to be civil rights leaders. They will be the people who will work in many cases to help African Americans leave the South and come to the city of Detroit during the Great Migration and find jobs, particularly at Ford Motor Company. And this church will be the largest donor to the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 and 1956. Martin Luther King Jr. would speak at this church a number of times. He visited the church when he was a teenager at 16 years old in 1945. But then as an adult, he would speak at this church a number of times. So Second Baptist Church is really the foundational religious center for African Americans in the state of Michigan and particularly in the city of Detroit. And now it sits in what is known as Greektown. But at one point, before Greek immigrants began arriving in the 1890s, that part of Greektown was part of a larger neighborhood known as Black Bottom, the Lower East Side of the city of Detroit. The Second Baptist Church is the oldest institution in what is now Greektown, but was a portion of Black Bottom. Dr. Ossian Sweet bought a home, him and his wife Gladys Sweet bought a home at 2905 Garland on the far east side of the city of Detroit. This neighborhood is predominantly white when they moved there in 1925. The home has a racial restrictive covenant on it, which means that the home is not to be sold, rented, or leased to a Negro. Dr. Sweet pays $6,000 more for the home, which is the equivalent in today's dollars of $90,000. So he pays an extra $90,000 in today's dollars for that home, which prompts the homeowners to sell it to him in violation of the racial restrictive covenant. However, when they move in September of 1925, a mob will show up on September 8th to try to run them out of the house. There are people surrounding the house, all over the streets next to the house, behind the house, on the side of the house, and they're really hollering all kind of epithets and threats at them, and they begin throwing bricks at the windows. As the windows are being busted by the bricks, Dr. Sweet, his wife Gladys Sweet, his brothers, Dr. Otis and Henry Sweet, his chauffeur, his handyman, and some of their friends are there, and they are all armed. And they return or respond to this mob who's threatening the house and throwing bricks through the windows by shooting into the crowd. 2 people in that crowd will be shot, one of whom will die. The police arrest everybody in the home, and they're charged with first-degree murder in 1925. So this is premeditated murder that they're being charged with. Basically, they're being charged with moving into the house to commit this murder. And so the NAACP hires a legal team led by Clarence Darrow. Clarence Darrow is the most well-known defense attorney in the country at that time. And he argues something that we now call castle doctrine, which is that a person has the right to defend their home. Defending your home is a form of self-defense. The first trial is a mistrial. It ends in a hung jury. The judge in the trial is Judge Frank Murphy, who is what we will later be calling a progressive Democrat, which is a group of people who are part of the Democratic Party, but who do not agree with the segregationist policies of the Southern Democrats. And so the second trial is Henry Sweet by himself. Henry Sweet is Dr. Sweet's youngest brother. He's the only person who's admitted to shooting that night. And so he's tried alone. In that trial, Clarence Darrow basically dares the jury to find his client guilty. He basically says, find my client guilty if you want to. But understand that when you do that, it's based on your prejudices and your fears. Because if this were any other family, this wouldn't even be a trial. And everybody knows what he's saying. He said if this were a white family and a mob showed up attacking the white family's home, they would have been in their rights to defend that home. But because this is a black family, these people are being tried at first-degree murder. Henry Sweet is acquitted, and the charges are dropped on everyone else. However, Mrs. Sweet has contracted tuberculosis in jail. She's brought it home to her 2-year-old daughter, who dies within months of the trial. She dies months after that. Henry Sweet dies months after that, all of tuberculosis. And Dr. Sweet himself is racked by financial issues and, of course, personal depression based on what's happened to his family. And we will lose Dr. Sweet himself to suicide. And so this is a victory without a real victory. But it did open up a part of the East Side for African Americans when they won this case. But racial restrictive housing covenants are the main form of discrimination in the 1920s in the city of Detroit. African Americans, as they began leaving the South during what is known as the Great Migration from 1910 to roughly 1970, in 1910, 95% of African Americans lived in a southern state. By 1970, 55% of African Americans lived somewhere other than a southern state. We call that time period the Great Migration. And a significant number of African Americans moved to the city of Detroit during that time. In fact, between 1910 and 1920, Detroit's African American community grows 600%. And so, because of housing discrimination, most African Americans live in the Lower East Side in the neighborhood known as Black Bottom. Because African Americans are making pretty good wages in comparison to sharecropping down south and tenant farming, many of them working at Ford and other plants, they're able to have a living wage. Many of them, having this living wage, begin to open up businesses. Many of them who may not open up their own businesses become customers of other Black businesses. Those Black businesses become a centered area just north of Black Bottom known as Paradise Valley. Paradise Valley would become the Black business and entertainment district in the city of Detroit from the 1920s until the 1950s. The area originates roughly in the area where Ford Field, Comerica Park, the 36th District Court is, and where 75 Freeway is today, but that was Hastings Street at that time. That area will have 350 Black-owned businesses either in that section or very close to that section. And we call that the Paradise Valley period and the Paradise Valley area. Hotels, clubs, restaurants, stores, shops, all the types of businesses that African Americans would need, including also churches, civic organizations, doctors' offices, and attorneys, all of them are stationed either in or close to that area known as Paradise Valley. This will be a Black business district. However, in 1949, the federal government passed the National Housing Act of 1949, giving cities money to do urban renewal. African Americans in the city of Detroit call this urban renewal Negro removal because it is their neighborhoods that are first destroyed and are destroyed most thoroughly. Black Bottom begins being destroyed starting in 1949, and then when the federal government passed the Interstate Highway Act of 1956, they began building the I-375 and I-75 freeway. The mayor at the time is Mayor Albert Cobo, who's run on a platform of segregation. He uses the money to begin tearing down Paradise Valley. Black Bottom is mostly all gone by this point, and Hastings Street will turn into a freeway. The land will be taken by eminent domain or sold. In fact, the owners are forced to sell so that the land can be redeveloped. African Americans will lose this Black business district, and because of property segregation, they won't be able to create a new one somewhere else in the city. But the legacy of Paradise Valley will live on because the music history, the business acumen will pass on to the next generation, and a large part of what will become Motown comes from that legacy of Paradise Valley. In 1959, Berry Gordy starts what is known as Tamla Records, which will of course become Motown Records. His studio, which he'll also live above, known as Hitsville, USA, will pump out some of the greatest artists in America's history. People like Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, the Four Tops, the Supremes, the Temptations, the Commodores and Lionel Richie, Martha and the Vandellas, Gladys Knight and the Pips, Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, and of course, Michael Jackson and the Jackson 5. These artists, who are household names by the 1960s and 70s, come out of this Detroit history. Berry Gordy and his family have been business people for decades. His father and mother, Berry Gordy Sr. and Bertha Gordy, have run a number of businesses, including the Booker T. Washington grocery store. All of their children are business owners, including Anna and Gwen, who were running a photo concession inside of the Flame Show Bar, one of the most popular clubs in the 1950s. And they will start a record company known as Anna Records, even before Berry starts his company. And so this attraction to music and pop culture has already been in the family. And Berry will turn this into the largest Black business in the country in the 1960s and 70s, Motown Records. From 1959 to 1972, they're stationed right here in the city of Detroit, and they will own a number of buildings right here on West Grand Boulevard. And of course, the Motown Museum, which is undergoing an expansion, will be founded by Barry's elder sister, Esther Gordy Edwards. And she will start this after Barry has relocated to Los Angeles, turning this into a museum, a destination spot for people all over the world. On June 23rd, 1963, the Detroit Walk to Freedom occurs. Martin Luther King Jr. will lead this march of 125,000 people from Brush Park on Woodward all the way down to the riverfront. And then it will culminate with a speech by him, which gives a portion of the I Have a Dream speech 2 months before it's given in Washington, D.C. at the March on Washington. This march was organized by the Detroit Council for Human Rights, led by Reverend Clarence LaVaughn Franklin, the pastor at New Bethel Baptist Church and a friend of Dr. King, and Reverend Clarence LaVaughn Franklin, C.L. Franklin. We probably know him best as the father of Aretha Franklin, the Queen of Soul. And Reverend Albert Clegg, who at that time the pastor of Central United Church of Christ, which will one day become the Shrine of the Black Madonna. These activist preachers will organize this march, which for 2 months is the largest civil rights demonstration in America's history. And at that march, Martin Luther King Jr. will give that speech at the end at Cobo Arena, which no longer exists. It is now, of course, the TCF Center. But he will give that speech at Cobo Arena, starting out with talking about problems in the South and the North. Problems like school segregation and job discrimination, which are northern issues, and housing discrimination, along with the segregation policies of the South and the refusal of allowing African Americans to register to vote. So he's merging these two fronts on civil rights. The northern front, which deals with housing discrimination and school inequality, and the southern front, which deals with the lack of African Americans having the right to vote. And he merges these two, and then he ends it with the crescendo of this dream that he said he had. And that will be stated again 2 months later at the March on Washington, where the world will hear that speech that was heard first at a large group in the city of Detroit. At 9125 12th Street, almost at the corner of 12th and Claremont, on July 23rd, 1967, the police conduct a raid at about 3 in the morning. When they go into the United Community League for Civic Action, which is a political organization as well as an after-hours club, sometimes called a blind pig, the police are expecting to arrest a small group of people, maybe 12, 15, or 20 people. It turns out there's 85 people there celebrating the return of 2 Vietnam War veterans. The police, who are at their lowest manpower on a Sunday, attempt to arrest and detain 85 people. And as it's taking them a long time to cycle this group into police cars and paddy wagons and take them to the 10th precinct, a crowd grows outside. And that crowd is becoming very opposed to the police's presence and what they're doing there. And as they begin to hurl threats at the police attempt to arrest some of the people who are leaders of this standoff, and the crowd begins to throw bricks at the police. The police are forced to retreat. When they return, some of the businesses have already been busted. The windows have been busted. There's some looting that has already started. And this is the beginning of a 5-day uprising, sometimes called the 1967 riots, but many times now referred to as the 1967 Detroit Rebellion. There's been a long history of negative relationships between the African American community and the police department. It's 1967 and the police department is 95% white and the city is 40% African American. The reason why the police department is so overwhelmingly white is because of the policies and segregation practiced within the police department itself. And this has caused a really negative relationship because of the police brutality incidents, the police shootings of African Americans, the way that the police are occupying the African American neighborhoods. And so this 5-day uprising will, of course, result in 43 deaths, the destruction of thousands of homes and businesses, and the injuries of many people, the arrest of thousands of people, and of course, the Algiers motel murders on the 3rd day of the uprising, where 3 black teenagers will be killed by members of the Detroit Police Department. And so this is one of the bloodiest periods in Detroit's history, and it will change Detroit's history forever.